All right, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We're going to give it a couple of minutes and get folks admitted to the room before we get started this afternoon. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. We do have a very full agenda today, so we will go ahead and get started. Morgan, can you just confirm sounding good? Screen looks good on your side?
Everything looks great, Maggie.
Thank you. Appreciate it. So I am Maggie Baldwin. I am the state veterinarian and director of the Animal Health Division at the Colorado Department of Agriculture. Welcome to today's webinar. This is intended for our Colorado veterinarians and producers, and if we have others on the line, welcome. But really hoping to give this group a good update on where are we with our highly pathogenic avian influenza response. So I am going to advance our slides. So first, we do have a new landing page that is available. Our website is going to be undergoing some construction over the coming days, trying to streamline some of the information that we have available. So Dr. McCarty, if you are able to drop that link in the chat for folks as well, so you guys can save that link if you don't already have it. That's a landing page right now that'll get you to, if you're looking for poultry information, dairy information, et cetera, and just a good central location. So for today's agenda, right now, we're welcome and introductions. I will start first with an overview of HPAI and where are we in our current outbreak. And Dr. McCarty will be going through the bulk tank testing program. Dr. Don Beckett, our USDA area veterinarian in charge, will be going through the USDA financial support available for producers. So if you're a producer on the line, that piece is going to be really important for you. If you haven't already taken advantage of the financial support that USDA has available, Dr. Beckett is a great resource for you. And Dr. Jamie Barnabei is going to be going through our epidemiology briefing. So what have we learned so far here in Colorado, and going through the updated national epi brief that was recently published. Dr. Allison Kohnen, our CDPHE state public health veterinarian, is going to be going through public health updates. And we are happy to have Dr. Greg Goodell from the Dairy Authority on to give the private practicing veterinarian perspective. So what does the support and response look like from a private practicing veterinarian for our producers? And we'll end with a Q&A. So a couple of logistics. So obviously we're using the Zoom platform today. This is being recorded, I believe. Let me make sure. Becky, you can confirm that this is being recorded for me. There's a control panel at the bottom of your screen, and you can see the different options down there. So for participants, you won't be able to be on audio or video unless, I believe, you raise your hand, and we can elevate your rights or privileges in the platform. So feel free to use the chat box. We do have the chat box open. It should be working and operational. If somebody that is a participant could confirm that you guys are able to chat to all of us, that would be great. So it's an open dialogue, open discussion. That's fantastic. You can raise your hand when we get to the Q&A portion to ask questions verbally. Closed captions are available if you need them. You can certainly enable those on your screen. And for our veterinarians, we will be posting a Google form in the chat box towards the end of the webinar to get your CE certificate. A couple of reminders. I think this shouldn't be an issue on participant side, but please keep yourself on mute and keep your video off unless you're speaking. It helps with the recording, also helps with bandwidth issues. So with that, I am going to get started. And okay, great. And it looks like we are seeing chats from folks. So thank you for confirming that. I'm going to get started with an overview of highly pathogenic avian influenza, but I wanted to have a couple slides on setting the stage. And some of this is really great information that we got from a dear friend of mine, Dr. Beckett. And I think this is really important as we look at this disease that has impacted two very different industries, not only in our state, but nationwide. I think it's really important to make sure that we are all on the same page when we talk about avian influenza and have shared understanding of the different perspectives that and the different impacts that each industry is facing. So first, there really is no us versus them. So our shared common enemy is the virus itself. We don't want to place blame on poultry or dairy or wild birds. Just remember that what we're really talking about is a virus that's causing a significant outbreak, and we want to make sure that the virus is the main shared common enemy, right? And so we're not talking us versus them. And it's also really important to highlight that we are only 6 months into this outbreak. This is not necessarily a novel disease, and I'm going to talk about that. What is the history that we know of with avian influenza, especially on the poultry side? But in dairy cattle, this is a novel outbreak, and we are seeing this impacting our dairy industry in ways that we haven't seen before. And we're still early in this. So we still have unknowns. We have a lot of things that we are trying to find out. We have a lot of things we are trying to learn, but we are still very early in this. So I want everybody to acknowledge that we've made a lot of progress in 6 months and have done a tremendous job responding to a novel disease and a novel outbreak. And a lot of that is because we have great partnership and collaboration. So the other thing is that perspective is important. And this is something that Dr. Beckett had shared at a meeting that I was at recently. So this is if you have a 6 or a 9 laying on a floor, right? And you have on the dairy industry side and the poultry industry side, 2 very different perspectives, right? The cow sees a 9 and the chicken sees a 6. And I think it's important if you put that into perspective of the virus itself. On the dairy cow side, this thing could make me sick, right? This virus could make the cows sick. It's not necessarily going to come in and wipe out an entire herd of dairy cows, but we'll talk about the illness that we have been seeing. But on the poultry side, this thing could kill me, right? This is a highly pathogenic virus that causes high mortality on the poultry side. So it's really important that we acknowledge for our 2 different industries that the perspective is very different, and the experiences that they have are very different. So I know there's been a lot of really passionate discussion about this outbreak and the impacts that this is having on our different industries, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So with that, I'm going to give an industry overview so you guys understand here in Colorado, what does the dairy industry and what does the poultry industry look like? And I think that also helps put into perspective those 2 different views of what the virus might impact. So our poultry industry in Colorado, we are not a very large laying hen state, but right now we have about 4.25 million laying hens. That number has varied and will probably continue to vary if we get over HPAI and we settle into our new cage-free rule coming in 2025. We'll have a good number. We'll have a better understanding of what that number will be like long term. But they produce just under 1 billion table eggs per year. So pretty good production from the state of Colorado. We also have on the western slope broiler breeder facilities, and there's a number of different complexes out there. They place about 650,000 breeders per year, and that's both male and female. And they produce about 80.5 million fertile eggs per year, all of which go to California, or almost all of which go to California. And those are what become our broiler chickens in the grocery stores, right? So that's a pretty good production on the western slope in Colorado. We also have niche layer flocks, some smaller networks of organic flocks. We have specialty flocks. There is one specialty flock on the western slope that produces 75% of the world's fly tying feathers. So if you're a fly fisherman, you've probably used flies that have come from that flock. We've also got waterfowl, game birds, backyard birds, exhibition birds, like most states do. Our dairy industry, we have about 200,000 milking cows, 105 licensed dairy farms that are licensed through CDPHE. That really boils down to 86 individual dairy cow premises. One statistic that our producers are very proud of is that we are ranked second nationally of milk produced per cow and 13th nationally in total milk production, producing about 5.2 billion pounds of milk annually. So we do have two pretty healthy industries here in Colorado that have been both significantly impacted by avian influenza. So a little bit of background. What is avian influenza? It's an influenza A virus that historically has been carried by waterfowl and shorebirds globally, right? We do surveillance globally to understand which strain is circulating that year. So there's annual surveillance that is done, and we have an understanding of what type of avian influenza is spreading. Is it low pathogenic or is it highly pathogenic? The H5 and H7 are the two types that can be highly pathogenic. So on the screen, you can see that is actually a picture of avian influenza. And it's classified based on the surface proteins. So the H's are the hemagglutinins, the N's are the neuraminidase, and there's a lot of different types of H's and a lot of different types of N's. You've probably heard H5N1, which is what we're talking about today, H3N2, H7N3. So all kinds of different types are found and found globally in waterfowl and shorebirds. But when we say highly pathogenic, that is specific to causing severe disease in poultry. So chickens, turkeys, pheasants, quail are domestic raised poultry. And it means that it causes more than 90% morbidity, mortality. So more than 90% illness and death in infected flocks that are affected by highly pathogenic avian influenza. We have occasionally seen spillover into other mammals. This is, again, prior to what we're dealing with now, and that causes a variety of symptoms. Historically, that has mostly been in our wild mammals, so things like foxes and skunk that are preying upon the sick and dead wild birds that are carrying this virus. And then the other important thing is it does have a zoonotic potential. And so that's why we include our public health partners in this discussion. And Dr. Kohnen is going to talk about that. So this is just a nice graphic that shows what I just talked about. So again, it's carried by those maintenance hosts, so our waterfowl and shorebirds globally, with spillover into our ag populations. We can, historically, that has been chickens, and swine is one that we're really concerned about. We can now add dairy cattle into that, but that was this is a unique spillover event that we're dealing with in dairy cattle. And then, of course, the human exposure. So this is something that I wanted to be very clear about, is what have we dealt with before with avian influenza, and why is that different than what we're dealing with now? So we have seen for a long, long time occasional outbreaks of highly pathogenic avian influenza, and those have historically been, again, the virus that has been carried and shed by wild birds. So typically those are going to be single spillover events. So as the migratory birds are migrating through certain areas, they are shedding the virus in their feces, that they can shed it in their respiratory droplets. And so, they are shedding this virus as they're migrating, and it's spilling over into our domestic poultry flocks. And prior to our 2014, 2015 outbreaks, we did see occasional lateral spread, so farm to farm spread. And this was really because before this time, we did have biosecurity in place in poultry facilities, but it was not a requirement before this. So we saw fomites, so people, vehicles, and equipment that were inadvertently transmitting this virus from farm to farm. And then in 2015, USDA made a change to their requirements that biosecurity is now required to be in place on poultry facilities, commercial poultry facilities, in order for them to be eligible for indemnity. So they will not receive indemnity if they have a detection of avian influenza and we have to depopulate that flock. They will not receive indemnity from USDA unless they can demonstrate that they had biosecurity in place and did everything that they could to prevent the disease from spreading to their flock. So since then, we've really not seen much lateral spread. So we have not seen a lot of farm to farm spread. And our mechanism of response, which has been, depopulation, disposal, and decontamination, has been effective in eliminating this virus from our domestic poultry flock. So yes, we are still seeing it shed and spread by wild birds occasionally, but our mechanism and methods of responding to this has been effective up until now. So prior to May of 2024, and this is what we call avian influenza as we knew it before, from April 2022 until May 2024, we had a total of 34 premises affected with avian influenza here in Colorado. And that was 9 commercial facilities, 25 non-commercial or backyard facilities, and we had more than 6.3 million domestic poultry impacted. So really significant impact to our poultry facilities here in Colorado. So on the poultry side, our response is really well outlined. It's very well structured. So we put a quarantine in place. Again, we go through depopulation, disposal, virus elimination activities on those facilities to prevent further spread of that virus. We have an area quarantine or a control area that's put in place. We have permitted movements. So nothing in that control area can move if it's poultry unless it has a permit. And we do surveillance in a 20-kilometer surveillance zone around infected poultry facilities. We also have a really robust response at the state level. And again, I touched on this, but biosecurity is a requirement by USDA for financial compensation for our poultry producers. And why is this? We've had a very well structured, very well scripted response on the poultry side because, again, it's a high mortality disease in poultry. We have USDA policies in place. We have state policies in place, a state response plan in place. And a lot of this is driven by international trade. So if we don't respond in this way to our poultry outbreaks, that could compromise our ability to trade poultry products internationally. So what has changed? And so what I really want everybody on the webinar to understand is, yes, what we've been dealing with for the last 2.5 years on the poultry side has been avian influenza, HPAI, H5N1. It's been the same clade we're dealing with now. But the HPAI in dairy cattle is a different beast. And so that's what I'm going to talk about over the next, let's see, how many more minutes do I have? 7 or 8 minutes. Morgan is going to keep me on time. And then we've got a lot of other presentations that are going to dive into more detail. So this is the same clade. It's 2344B, but what's specific when we talk about the dairy strain, and there's some strong feelings about calling it that, but that is the genotype. And there's a typo on there. My apologies. It's genotype B313, and that's on some subsequent slides. So when we say genotype B313, that's specifically the strain that is circulating in our dairy population. You might also hear this referred to as bovine influenza A virus. What's unique about this is in dairy cattle, it causes, it mostly affects milk production, is one of the most significant clinical signs that we're seeing. And the milk has high viral viral load. So we're seeing a lot of virus in milk in infected cows. Good news is that pasteurization is effective. Dr. McCarty already dropped the CDA update link in there so you guys can track that. The USDA update website, Morgan, if you could drop that in the chat as well. It was undergoing construction earlier today, so they were doing updates on their website. So I'm not sure if it's live yet or not, but that is a good website to keep track of. So in our dairy herds, those that have rumen monitors on, the earliest clinical sign that they're seeing is decreased rumination. In one of our herds, one of our earliest herds in Colorado that had rumen monitors on, they actually thought over the weekend that their rumen monitoring system broke because they had so many cows that had significant decrease in rumination. So that was the earliest clinical sign they had. Decreased feed consumption. And then again, the significant one is this decreased milk production. And the milk that they are producing is a thicker colostrum-like concentrated milk. Other signs, abnormal feces, low-grade fever. So most cattle do appear to recover with supportive care, but I don't think that we quite understand what all of the long-term impacts are. And we have heard from some of our producers that they've had higher cull rates, and some of those cattle are not coming back into full milk production. So in Colorado, again, the B313, this is April 2024 to present. We have had 64 confirmed positives, and actually that released number is even higher. I think we are up to 59 herds that have been released from quarantine as of this week. On the poultry side, we are seeing spillover of the B313 strain from dairy back to poultry, and we've had 2 confirmed backyard flocks affected, 3 confirmed flocks at the commercial level that has impacted more than 3.3 million domestic chickens in the state of Colorado. We've also seen 6 domestic cats that have been impacted and 10 humans, and Dr. Kohnen's going to talk about that. So this map is not updated again, because when I was updating my slides earlier today, the USDA website was down. But as of today, the USDA dashboard, you can go, I'm hoping, and I'm not sure, Morgan, if it looks like it still is under maintenance. So if you guys flag that website and go back to it, hopefully it's updated tomorrow and you can see the new dashboard. The dashboard is actually really handy. It's, I think, a Tableau server. So you can look at total outbreak. You can look at last 30 days. There's been a total number of 14 states affected and 256 dairy premises. Now, California is the most recent affected state, and we are seeing a really significant increase over the last couple of weeks in detections in California. A lot of that is due to their really enhanced surveillance efforts after they had their first detection. So, and there was my other slide. I guess I had it in there twice, and that's with the correct number. So again, transmission in dairy cattle, whole genome sequencing really is what we're looking at. This is something that USDA is doing, and it has been really helpful in understanding the spread of this virus and the most closely linked premises. And Dr. Barnabei is going to go more into detail on the epi side. So epi information that our producers have been providing through those epi questionnaires has been critically important in helping us understand the possible mechanisms of transmission. So we do know that the initial spillover of this virus was by wild birds into a dairy herd, they believe in the Texas Panhandle region around December 2023. So this was an isolated single spillover event. And since then, the subsequent spread of this virus has been cow to cow and farm to farm. Now, whether that's direct or indirect, we're still learning more about that. There's a couple of theories that there's spread via milking and milking equipment in the dairy parlor. And there's been studies that have shown that is the case and studies that have shown that isn't the case. But again, we're very early in the outbreak, so we're still trying to understand more. There's also likely a shortened respiratory phase of this virus, like most influenza viruses, that there is some respiratory shed, and we are seeing some nasal swabs that are coming back positive on infected dairy cattle. So the farm-to-farm spread may be associated either directly with movement of cattle or also indirectly via fomites. So people, vehicles, and equipment can be carrying and shedding and spreading the virus from one farm to another if we are not practicing really good biosecurity. Concerns, again, spill over into poultry farms, spill back into local wildlife. We are not seeing the B313 strain circulating in wild birds. We have not found it yet in wild bird surveillance, which means that this virus is not spreading like our typical avian influenza viruses have spread in the past, which has been, again, our migratory waterfowl coming through, dropping the virus in its farm to farm introduction by wild birds. That is not what we're seeing in this, which also gives us hope that we may be able to get ahead of this. And if we understand the virus spread, the mechanisms for spread, we can hopefully put mechanisms in place to prevent spread of this virus. I'm not going to go too much into this because we have a lot of folks that are going to talk about these different pieces. We have an emergency rule in place. I think most of you know that. Dr. McCarty is going to talk about our bulk tank testing and some of the voluntary testing we still have available. Dr. Beckett's going to talk about the financial support and the mandatory testing. So, this is a lot of work that would not be possible without all the people on this call, and honestly, all of you that are listening in, producers and veterinarians alike. So what are some of our next steps? Really looking at trying to define what are our state goals in response and what are our national goals in response. There's a lot of discussion of what does elimination of H5N1 in dairy cattle look like? What would it look like to have a really robust surveillance strategy at the national level or individual state level to help us get to a strategy of elimination? So we will update our response as we understand the disease better, as we understand what those mechanisms of transmission are. But I think we have been really responsive here in Colorado, and I'm really proud of my team that has worked so hard on this response, and all of our producers that have been great collaborators, and our veterinarians that are supporting them as well. But we also don't quite yet understand what the long-term impacts are to our dairy herds. So, I think we want to take another look at that now that we're 6 months in. What are our herds looking like now? Now, do we have better understanding of what those long-term impacts look like? So if you are a dairy producer, we'll probably be reaching back out to you guys and trying to get a better understanding of what your long-term impacts have been. And then the other thing that I think is really important, again, this has been a novel outbreak, is what lessons can we learn from this outbreak and apply them to other foreign animal diseases? So really looking at a lot of it is going to revolve around biosecurity. So I think that is all that I had on my slides, and I'm going to stop sharing. And I believe that we have Dr. McCarty up next to speak about our bulk tank testing program.
Great. Thanks, Maggie. Can you hear me okay?
We can hear you, and the slides look great, Morgan.
Okay, great. Good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining tonight. It's actually really exciting to see so many folks who are interested in these updates. We've been working really hard, as you guys know, for the past 6 months here in Colorado. And so I'm going to go over what the testing programs in Colorado have looked like. And I'm the assistant state veterinarian, for those who don't know me. I've been with CDA for a little over 3 years, and working with a great group of folks. We've got these programs stood up rather quickly. So to give a little bit of a timeline for everybody. So March of 2024 over here, we were just hearing about this dairy cow syndrome, as we were calling it back then, and had a lot of curiosities about what may be causing it. And we soon learned towards the third, fourth week of March that it was related to H5N1. And so we started scrambling, as you can likely imagine, in our office, going, okay, what are we going to do if this comes to Colorado? And certainly we were doing some tracing and some epi work on movement documents, trying to figure out, was there a level of exposure in Colorado from movements out of Texas and Kansas as the syndrome was being seen in those states initially. And so certainly it didn't take very long. As you can see on the timeline, April 22nd was our first symptomatic herd that was reported to us. I didn't put the confirmation date, but I do believe it was April 24th. That was presumptive positive at CSU, and then very soon after that confirmed at NVSL in Ames, Iowa, National Veterinary Services Laboratory. So unfortunately, we were thrown into the mix rather quickly. Didn't have a lot of time to put together a plan. We were kind of still trying to sort out what that might look like. So just a month into the syndrome, we were faced with what are we going to do with this? And so by mid-June, we knew that we wanted to establish some sort of voluntary bulk tank milk testing program. USDA had put the federal order together. They were starting to put together a testing program of their own. But by June 20th, we launched our voluntary testing program. I'll go into a little bit of details on that, but we had at that time approximately 20 confirmed cases. And so we were escalating things a little quickly in Colorado. And then unfortunately, not too soon after that, July 7th was our first commercial poultry detection with the B313 genotype. And so we were starting to get a little more antsy going, okay, what are we going to do for testing? And then boom, July 14th, our second large commercial poultry detection happened. And just, a week later, we stood up the mandatory bulk tank testing program. So between July 14th and July 22nd, we were really scrambling to put together the mandatory program. And you can see just in that month between June 20th and July 22nd, we had an additional 30 confirmed cases. And I think it's important to note that these were confirmed cases through reporting. HPAI is a mandatory disease to report in Colorado in all species. And so thankful to the veterinarians and producers who were astute and did go ahead and report these cases. But by the time our order was effective on July 22nd, we had about 50 confirmed cases. And then the order went into effect. It took us roughly a week to really get organized, to get our first samples and figure out what that process was going to look like. So, and then of course, here we are in October, and I'll go through some of those results and what that bulk tank testing program looked like. So initially, as I mentioned, we did stand up the voluntary bulk tank testing program in June. It was two separate programs. One was commercial and one was a raw milk program, completely voluntary. How it would work was there was an enrollment program. Weekly testing would be done of both the bulk tanks and pooled hospital pens. And then we worked with CDPHE and their milk program to put together submission forms for producers and also the testing kits. And we mailed those testing kits out to any producers who were interested. Of course, the caveat to that was this wasn't just anonymous surveillance. If a sample did come back as positive, just like if the case had been reported to us with clinical signs, a case manager was assigned, and then the premises was quarantined at that point, and then having to go through what the quarantine would look like. And I didn't have it in a slide, but I'll go through what those parameters were. And unfortunately, it was limited participation. So initially, there was a lot of folks who said, yeah, I think I want to participate. And then for some reason, when it came down to it, we just had a handful of folks who really wanted to participate. So certainly once we launched the program in June, and then of course seeing the clinical cases rise, we were confirming quite a few dairy cases, and of course the two poultry premises really made us step back and go, okay, we need to do something a little bigger and broader for surveillance. So that was the mandatory bulk tank testing program that went into effect on July 22nd. And of course, you guys can read what the parameters of that were. It is posted on the website. But basically what it was that these samples have to be collected weekly from every licensed dairy cow farm in Colorado. And how CDPHE licenses was we had 105 prems, and I know Dr. Baldwin mentioned that in her slide. we ended up with 86 total prems that would be under this mandatory order. So we went from 105 to 86, and some of those were bifurcated dairy, so they sold a raw milk and a liquid pasteurized product that was not included. And then some of those dairies were same premise but separate silos that are sampled, but we counted that as one premise. So 86 is where we landed on to be tested weekly. And any dairy that was released from their quarantine previous to this order would fall under the order as well. So while they were previously testing weekly to be released from quarantine, they would continue to test weekly as part of this order. They'd be collected by the CDPHE certified sampler, and they must be submitted to CSU. And then, of course, if they were non-negative, they would fall under the terms of the quarantine. And as far as the terms of that quarantine, basically our quarantine order said that there would be weekly bulk tank testing. So kind of a repeat, right? So if you're under quarantine, you're bulk tank testing. If you're under the mandatory order, you're weekly bulk tank testing. So pretty much everyone's just weekly bulk tank testing, whether you're under quarantine or not. You're required to follow the Colorado pasteurized milk ordinance for HPAI, follow all the biosecurity measures that we recommended, and we sent out those biosecurity measures with the quarantine to producers. And then we limited the movement of cull cows. So lactating cows that were non-clinical were permitted to move directly to slaughter in the state of Colorado. Otherwise, we recommended that those cows be dried up and sold when they were non-clinical and dry at that point. So, and then of course, part of the quarantine and also the mandatory order of testing was all producers had to comply with the epidemiological investigations that we had, which was surveys and also our Epi Strike team. So what does it actually look like for the mandatory bulk tank program? And I have to tell you all that Colorado was the first state to put together a mandatory statewide program. Massachusetts has since done it as well. And there are various other states that do surveillance zone testing, but not a full statewide program. So really, when we were putting this together, we didn't have a lot of guidance or a lot of guidelines to go by. We were just trying to do what made sense and work with our outstanding partners. And of course, CDPHE, the milk program, Brad Turpin and his crew, work lead is Ryan Allen on that program, really were phenomenal and an integral piece to the success of the mandatory bulk tank testing program. And of course, the CSU Diagnostic Lab. Without either of those partners, we would not have been able to do this program at all. So I do have a slide that kind of goes through how we do the collection and what happens. But basically, the milk program manages the sample collection. The diagnostic lab runs and tests those samples, and we track the cases and the quarantines. And of course, any sample that came back positive during this mandatory program would mean that the premises was under quarantine, much like the voluntary program. Just want to double check my time here. Okay, so I think I'm doing okay on time. So a lot of other states have been interested on what are the logistics of on-farm sample collection and how did it work. We were very, very fortunate that the major co-op in Colorado was agreeable to work with CDPHE and work with us as far as sample collection. And because the folks who are collecting the milk on a daily basis and bringing it to the plant, those collectors are already certified with CDPHE to collect their samples already. And so it worked out fantastic that they would either collect a duplicate sample for us or use their temperature sample for HPAI testing. So the person collecting that sample would bring the sample to the satellite office. So that's not necessarily the plant, that's a satellite office for the co-op. And then a CDPHE milk program employee would go to the satellite office, pick out the samples, complete the submission form for each dairy, and then bring those samples to CSU. So they're hand delivering those samples to CSU. And then, of course, we would get the results and then work from there. For the herds that are not in a major co-op, and there definitely are some here in Colorado, they're independent, or perhaps they are their own producer. They still have a certified sampler on their dairy because they're still required to sample for CDPHE anyways as part of the milk program. So those samples were collected by a certified sampler. Those were placed in collection kits, and we put those kits together, and then they were shipped via UPS to the diagnostic lab. And then, of course, once we got those results, everything was handled very similar. So here are the collection kits that CDA and CDPHE put together, and they were distributed to either the independent or the dairies that are not part of the co-op. And some of these were hand delivered, some of these were mailed to them. They were mailed 8 weeks worth of collection supplies at a time, and the kits were completely built for them. The submission forms were filled out for them. All they had to do is fill out the date and who collected the sample, and then put it in the cooler box with the ice pack. And the mailing label was supplied for them as well. So slap that mailing label on the box and send it on off to CSU. So we really had hoped to make the process as easy as possible for folks, so that way it didn't seem like an onerous process, and haven't had too many complaints about the process yet. So what did that look like? So the first week, we knew the first week was going to be interesting, and it was a little bit. We certainly were scrambling, and a lot of folks wanted to know, how's it going? And that was, the first samples were collected on 7/29, and on 7/30, everyone wanted to know what's the results. And of course, we didn't have them, right? And so the samples are collected by the certified sampler, but then they're taken to the satellite office. They're not collected until Tuesday by CDPHE. Late Tuesday, they're taken to the lab. Wednesday, the lab has to sort them, and they start running them. And then, of course, we start getting those bulk emails with test results either Thursday or Friday. And of course, the lab runs the positive samples twice to make sure that they are accurate, which we very much appreciate. So first week, 86 dairies were sampled. We knew that we had, 31 previous positive dairies on there. And then we had 12 new positive dairies and 43 negative dairies. So the numbers, as far as the previous positive dairies, we had released some dairies from quarantine. So that's why, even though we had multiple more confirmed cases, some of those dairies had already been released from quarantine. So that brought our total number of positive dairies in the state that we had experienced total, not just in that week time frame, to 64, which was roughly 74% of our licensed dairies that we had found to be positive. So of those new positive dairies, those 12 did go under quarantine. And then we have been tracking these bulk tank samples now out. I don't have the data yet for this week because it's only Wednesday. So we're going off of last week's data. Once again, we sampled 86 dairies. We had 1 positive and 85 negative dairies. So you can see we are making progress. And here's just the representation of that data. We did not have any new positives after week 1. Week 5 and week 6, we did have 2 positives from herds that were previously released from quarantine, and I do have a slide of that. So as you can see, we are making progress, and I think this graph it clearly represents what we've been anecdotally hearing about. Perhaps this virus is lingering about 8 weeks, somewhere in that 8-week mark. Certainly, there's some dairies that cleared it faster than 8 weeks, and some are still lingering well after 8 weeks. But I think this is a pretty good representation of what we've been hearing anecdotally. So here's something a little bit interesting. This is just a snapshot of the spreadsheet that I keep. And we release dairies from quarantine after 2 negative tests that are 7 days apart. And so keep track of those with a color, which is really nice. In red, you can see those were, that was a dairy that was previously released from quarantine. They did unfortunately go back under quarantine because of a CT value or a test result that was not favorable. They were positive for 2 weeks and then went ahead and were negative and then negative again 7 days later. So they are released from quarantine. And dairies that had CT values over 36 that were previously released from quarantine, you can see down on the 819 number, that's light blue, that dairy did not go back under quarantine. So a little bit of a complicated spreadsheet to keep track of, but it's served us very, very well. You can just kind of see the length of time and the number of tests that we've performed. And certainly this actually goes way back to June, but I didn't have enough room on the screen to go way back. So I think I'm right up on my time. And, these are certainly the same things that Dr. Baldwin brought up as far as what's next. And, as of right now, we are continuing the bulk tank milk surveillance program. The mandatory program is in effect until Dr. Baldwin and Commissioner Greenberg go ahead and vacate that order. And when that's going to be, we aren't 100% sure yet. So certainly we still have dairies that are testing positive. We still have 5 dairies under quarantine in our state. So we're looking at, weeks down the road, what is that going to look like? And of course, is there a national bulk tank milk surveillance program coming up or not? So we will, follow any orders that are put forth on the federal level. Certainly, it is required to continue reporting sick cows. And so if folks, veterinarians or producers have suspicion that high path AI is in the herd, then we do expect that to be reported because it is required. And then, we are continuing voluntary surveillance on commercial poultry premises. So the premises that were depopulated back in July are starting to repopulate, which is fantastic news. And we'll continue to do surveillance on those premises. So that's all I have this evening. Once again, thanks again for joining us during your dinner hours.
Excellent. Thank you, Morgan. Don, I am going to get your slides ready. Happy to have Dr. Don Beckett on the call with us to talk about the financial portion.
Thanks, Maggie. So Dr. Don Beckett, I'm the area veterinarian in charge for Colorado. And Maggie's offered to drive the slides because I don't have very many. So you can go to the next one, Maggie. So USDA, of course, is a huge partner with both the state producers, trying to take care of our stakeholders and veterinarians. And so one of the aspects that we are supporting everyone or trying to support everyone as much as we can is with these financial supports. And so we have funding available for PPE support, biosecurity planning, milk treatment, veterinary costs, and sample shipping. We're probably not doing sample shipping in reimbursement in Colorado because of our current program, and then ELAP indemnities. And so I'm going to drop that ELAP website in the chat. And then the other supports is we have dairy herd status program, currently about north of 50 herds enrolled in the national sampling program for similar, but not exactly like Colorado's bulk milk tank sampling program. That allows the herds to move across state lines without doing individual cow testing. And then, of course, we're supporting and driving and hopefully getting a lot of H5N1 research completed. And in the state of Colorado, my heartfelt thanks to at least 5 or 6 of the producers that have participated in these longitudinal studies and others who have allowed wildlife services to trap and gather creatures on their premises so that we can continue to investigate how this stuff is spreading and how long it's staying in the cows, and those kind of questions we're trying to get answers to. Next one, Maggie, please. So this is a little bit more detail on those financial support programs. So of the affected premises, we have up to $2,000 for PPE support, biosecurity planning. You get up to $1,500. Milk treatment, which typically is waste milk, and for colostrum up to $8,000, and the veterinary costs up to $10,000. Doesn't take very long to get to that when these cows are that sick. And then unaffected premises have those values that you see there that are available. That same website that is not up today, USDA is just having a whale of a day with our whale of the week, actually, with our internet and those kind of things. And so when that site comes back up under the site that's under maintenance that was posted by Morgan, when it comes back up, it'll have all kinds of details. Next, Maggie. And so regardless of what state you're in, your area veterinarian in charge is the point of contact. And I see many of my friends and fellow AVICs from other states that are on the call, and so welcome and thanks for attending. This QR code will get you to, if that works, will get you to a list of the state area veterinarian in charge for each of the states, and so you can find out who your contact is. My email address and my cell phone number is there. We also have a financial specialist, Cheryl Dutro, who's been working her butt off to help the current producers who are already receiving funding under the program. And so you may see an email from Cheryl if you're enrolled and you're getting some funding. So reach out to me if you have any problems. If you are an affected dairy, the case manager probably already gave you the information and enrollment forms, but feel free to reach out if that's usually a pretty hectic time when you're treating sick cows and this kind of thing. So I am giving back time for the next presentation because I think that's way more interesting. And so I would like to segue that to Dr. Jamie Barnabei so she can talk about epi, because epidemiology is fun. So thanks, Maggie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Beckett. Really appreciate that overview of the financial resources. And I do see we do have a lot of producers on, so hopefully if you haven't already taken advantage of that, please do. Jamie, if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen. Looks great.
Okay, and just last minute check, you can hear me okay, correct?
We can hear you well. Yep.
Perfect. Well, good evening, everyone. My name is Jamie Barnabei. I am a veterinary medical officer with USDA APHIS. I've been with the department for a little over 7.5 years now. And my role in Colorado is that of an emergency coordinator. So I'm pleased to give you an update on the epidemiology, a lot of the analyses that have been done since H5N1 emerged in the dairy cattle. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. And I can't start this presentation without giving a huge shout out to our Colorado dairy producers and the industry. You all are absolutely remarkable. And I hope that you can appreciate that you have really, you're leading by example and you've set a standard and you've done so at a national level. So I hope that you're proud of that. Also, a huge thanks to all our case managers, the Epi Strike team. We've had folks deploy out to help with this outbreak. And of course, our laboratory colleagues. None of this would be possible without all of the folks listed here. Now, you guys saw this national overview from Dr. Baldwin already. We're sitting at those 256 confirmed cases. And all I really want to say about this is that while we're fortunate enough to be on kind of a downturn in the number of cases in Colorado, this virus is very much still out there. It is still circulating. We are up 13 cases nationally, not in Colorado, just from Friday alone. So hopefully we continue on this trend, but I don't want us to become complacent either. Now, at the national level, we've got some field activities going on. So those EPI questionnaires, I have a strong feeling many of you are intimately familiar with the EPI questionnaires, but those are going on across the country. We have on-farm field research. This focuses on a few priority topics. Typically, the participation in this is voluntary, and this is ongoing in a number of states, including in Colorado to this day. And if you're somebody who would like to participate in that as an affected producer, please reach out through your case manager, and we'll see what our options are. We also have some sampling happening in the wildlife and peri-domestic species. This is conducted by USDA Wildlife Services. And what they're doing is looking at some of those species that are on or just around some of our affected dairy premises. And then lastly, we have those epi-strike teams. They are teams of animal health specialists who come out. So most of the analyses that I'm going to show you today were done by this team that came out to support us here. Now, this next slide is giving you a little bit of the national epi picture. So our national epi team has fully analyzed 148 questionnaires from across the country, and they're breaking down some of these activities in terms of the percentage of farms that have reported it. Now, this graphic is really just a high-level overview of some of the most common exposure pathways that have been identified. So I'm sure none of you are shocked to hear that that comes down to movement of animals, machines and equipment, and people. So if we break this down a little more, that graphic on the left-hand side that shows you the animal component is really showing you the percentage of farms who received any class of cattle in the 30 days prior to breaking with clinical signs. And that first bar chart over on the right-hand side of the slide is showing the top two classes of animals that were received throughout the outbreak, and it's come down to first lactation heifers and then other lactating cows. And then we move over to our machines graphic, which is telling us that 38% of farms have reported moving cattle using shared equipment. And the second set of the bar charts over to the right also shows us that less than half, so about 16% of those farms actually clean that shared equipment prior to using it. And then the third bar chart is showing that 23% of farms use the same equipment to handle both feed and manure. However, only about half, or about 10%, clean it between use. Now that third wheel, now we're starting to get into the people component. So most of the affected dairies reported having a high number of visitors that have frequent contact with their cattle. This is primarily through support service personnel, and we'll talk about some of the Colorado specific data in a few slides. In addition to visitors, we've also had dairies reporting they have employees who visit other dairies, own their own personal livestock or poultry, work on another dairy, or work on another farm that also has livestock. And again, all of these represent potential exposure pathways. Lastly, we have the graphic over on the right showing that 74% of all affected dairies have had cats present on the operation, and 33% of them have actually observed sick or dead cats, which makes sense because we do know that cats are also a victim of this virus. And now this is the national picture for the clinical aspect of this. And at the end of the day, this disease is extremely variable in our farms, ranging from asymptomatic, where some of these herds have had no obvious signs of disease at all, to many that have been highly, highly affected to the extent where they've had perhaps a dozen cattle or more die. Now, nationally, they're saying that it seems like the clinical or the average for showing clinical disease is about 6 days. We're going to come back to that. But some of our common clinical signs include a drop in milk production. And so if you look down here at the bottom, you can see the breakout of the different descriptions for what folks have reported across the country in terms of that abnormal milk. But nearly all affected herds who were clinical have reported fever, dehydration, loss of appetite, some abortions, some respiratory signs, other GI signs. And now coming back to that 6 days, and if you're an affected producer, you're probably going, only 6 days? No, maybe you're still dealing with it and it's been weeks or it's been months. This is an underestimation of the clinical picture. And that's because when we come out to do this EPI questionnaire, we sit down with you all that day. And our focus is what's happened in the 30 days prior to this, right? Trying to understand when symptoms started, the types of symptoms that you've seen, but you don't get that forward follow-up to understand how long it's been affecting that herd. So don't be surprised when we reach out to try and solidify some of the numbers with you all so that we can have an accurate picture of how it's truly affected your herd. Okay. Now we're going to get to the Colorado specific data. And we're looking at this EPI curve here, and you can see that for Colorado, this indeed started in the week of April 21st. And we really saw a smattering of dairies affected into May, into early June, and these blue bars represent dairies. We'll talk about the other colors when we get to them. But then you can see here that in about the second week of June, we start to see an uptick in the number of dairies detected before hitting our record number in the week of the 16th at 12 new detections within that week. The following week, we saw the break in 2 backyard poultry flocks. The week after that, we saw our first large commercial egg layer break with H5N1. And you can imagine these were a very stressful series of weeks across the board, because then we had yet another record spike of another 12 detections within the following week. And into mid-July, we saw the last two spillover into poultry operations, another commercial egg layer, and an egg layer pullet facility. The black line here is showing you when the mandatory testing order went into effect. And your last real takeaways with this epi curve is that you can see the majority of our cases took place here early, where we were still in a voluntary testing stance. And that's great. Kudos to you guys as an industry for the reporting and being proactive about it. But critically, you can also see that on this half, we still have dairies who were detected after mandatory testing went into effect. And they were only picked up because of that bulk tank milk testing. In other words, there were no clinical signs of disease. We wouldn't have known if we hadn't tested, and we wouldn't have an accurate just how far the disease has spread. Okay, sorry, trying to get myself back over here. This next graphic, we're comparing 2 different dates. We're looking at our presumptive date, and this is the date of the very first laboratory result that you get, and that's the one that comes from CSU. Now, all of these have been confirmed, but we're using the presumptive date, and those are shown in this by all of these blue bars. You can see we've got 64 of those. And then we're comparing the date of onset of clinical signs in those herds. And those are the orange bars, and there are 58. Now, the primary 2 takeaways of this analysis are really that we found there's a lag time. There's a lag time between the date that the animals are first noticeably sick and then the date that they're reported, and thus testing can occur and all of that. Now, this is troublesome or tricky because that lag time is the window of opportunity for our enemy, the virus, to do what it does best, because we haven't yet recognized that there's a real problem here. So that's the opportunity for infectious animals to move, for contaminated equipment to move, and for people to inadvertently spread a virus around. The second thing that we've noticed with this is that you'll notice the numbers here, 58 versus 64. We have more dates for laboratory results than we have dates for reporting clinical signs. And this fits with that variable clinical picture that I've talked about on the other slides. So some dairies, right, are seeing either such mild clinical signs or really not many at all, that they didn't realize that they were infected with H5N1 until they were picked up through the bulk tank testing. And that fit with that national picture, but it also fits anecdotally with what producers here in Colorado have told us, where it's been extremely variable, whether they were clinical and it was kind of disastrous, or whether they went, "Are you sure? I can't believe that I'm even affected. Nothing's wrong with my herd." Now, we're going to change gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about some of the common service providers. And guys, when I go through each one of these, I'm going to point out, right, the big takeaways, but I'm also going to talk a lot about what these things don't necessarily tell us. We don't want to make incorrect conclusions through this analysis. So this is looking at common service providers. This is a cohort of about 25 dairies. We went back out with an additional EPI questionnaire that was looking at routine movements. So what kind of traffic is really coming on and off of a dairy on any given day? So each one of the colors represents a different category of service provider. And then those bars are telling you how many dairies are using the same service provider. So your big takeaway is there's quite a lot of overlap. Now, in some ways, this makes a lot of sense. In some categories, we have a limited number of businesses in some of these categories. And just because there's overlap does not mean that that's definitively how the virus is spreading. But the things that we think about when we look at this are the more dairies that a particular vehicle or person from a company or wherever visits, the more important that things like cleaning and disinfection and those basic biosecurity principles become to prevent any possible viral spread. So another way we can also think about the risk of these service providers is when they're coming onto the property, what is their level of interaction with the cattle on that property? Can they drop off their delivery far away from the animal pens and avoid any of the high traffic areas? Well, great. Then they probably represent a lower risk than a vendor who has to come in and interact directly with the herd. So really, we do know that there's a lot of service provider overlap, but we don't know whether any of these contacts are actually significant in this outbreak, right? So we're still very much learning. This is very new. You've heard that from the other speakers so far. Now, nobody panic about these. We're going to have a couple of chaotic looking analyses come up on the next few slides. This is a network visualization, and this is the same information that we've been talking about. So we're looking at common service providers. Now, your green circles in here are the dairies, the exception being the two that are circled in purple and labeled poultry. They are poultry operations. And then we have these red circles as our service providers. And what this is showing us is that the size of those circles or those nodes reflects the number of connections that premises or that provider has to the overall network. So the larger the dot, the more connections they have within it. It's really a great way to see the level of interaction or interconnection that we have in the state of Colorado, and even some overlap with the poultry operations. So really what we've seen and what we've learned is there isn't a single dairy in this analysis that doesn't have multiple, if not dozens, of outside vehicles coming on and off the property daily. But critically, this analysis also tells us this is only looking at service providers. It's not taking into account any overlap in personnel or other visitors who may also play a role in inadvertently spreading that virus. Now, what we have found and what we do know is that about 16% of employees and 9% of household members of affected dairies also work on other dairy premises. Now, we did find that none of the affected dairies had employees who were also working on poultry premises, but we did find that about 3% of dairies did have employees with family members who worked on poultry premises. So again, just kind of in the background, something to think about, that level of interaction and that connection as a potential risk pathway. Now, what this really shows us is how much traffic it takes to keep a dairy running. And when we think about flu viruses, we typically think about them as being fragile, and especially in a hot and dry environment. And that sounds exactly like a Colorado summer, doesn't it? Well, our outbreak primarily took place this summer. So it doesn't make sense. And what it tells us is that we have more work to do to understand how the virus has been getting around, how it's surviving, how it's persisting, what mechanisms it's using to continue that spread. And connections like this are really just the start of that. Now, this table is another way for us to visualize those connections. We've got about 22 dairies in this table and 2 poultry facilities. And your big takeaways are that you probably noticed this slide has a lot of numbers, but there are very few zeros. So we're looking at the count of connections between the dairies and those poultry industries. And what we found is that almost all of the dairies that we worked with are connected at some level to all of the other dairies in this analysis. And many of them also have connections to the poultry. So let's dive into it a little further. Everything highlighted in orange and the numbers in red. This is the upper 50% of connections of those 22 dairies. So they had to have a minimum of 8 connections, but you can see some of them maxed out at 15. And the important thing to note with this is these are not direct connections. They are indirect through common service providers. And just because 2 locations use the same service, so like a garbage service, just because you use the same garbage service for your pickup doesn't mean that it's the same truck going to both of those farms. So this overlap, when we look at it, just suggests, right, that the potential for the risk is there and that further investigation might be warranted. Now, let's pull those poultry premises into it. So now we're highlighting in yellow. And I didn't highlight any of the zeros in it, but the primary 2 poultry premises included in this analysis, they have indirect connections with 18 dairies right off the bat. And now we're going to look at another, sticking with our connections theme, right, with the service providers. I know that this looks chaotic. So these blue lines are those same connections that we've been talking about in all of these other slides, right, through those common service providers. You'll also notice there were a whole bunch of circles on this slide. So these circles, we're using this because we've now taken analyses of the virus itself. And we do this through whole genome sequencing. And if you're not familiar with what that is, sequencing is really just a way for us to track small changes in a virus over time. And this is an influenza virus, so we know it's an RNA virus, not a DNA virus. They are inherently more prone to making mistakes as they replicate. So there's a lot of diversity and a lot of changes. That's very routine. And what we use, or how we manipulate this, is that when those viruses pick up those changes or undergo those mutations, they're cumulative. And what that really means is once it picks up a change, it's not going to change back. So we can use those over time and look at a particular set of changes in the virus from samples taken from one farm and compare it to samples taken from another farm. And there's really one of two things that we primarily take away from this. And one of those is that sometimes that sequencing gives us direction of transmission. But most of the time, it's just a way for us to understand how closely related or not are the viruses from these different farms. So we're going to simplify this slightly. I'm going to gray out most of it just to highlight a few big takeaways. These red arrows are showing you cases where we can demonstrate that the virus definitely went from dairy X to dairy Y and not from Y to X. As an example. Or here, there are two prime examples where we took samples from the infected poultry operations, and the sequences of those viruses suggest that they came from dairies. And sometimes it gives us kind of a picture, if you look at the one over here on the right side, where we can see that one sequence shows up that it came from a dairy, but then there was a cluster of dairies who may have been infected around the same time because we didn't see a lot of diversity in those viruses. So these circles are telling us that those samples, those viruses, are more closely related genetically than farms that aren't in that same circle. Lastly, the reality, guys, this is really interesting. I think it's fascinating data and it's ongoing. The situation on the ground is very complex, and this type of information is probably giving us more granular or more, it's almost too detailed for us to apply it practically in a lot of ways, but it does kind of give us a lot of insight in the background times. Now, well done sticking through that. I'm going to wrap it up. We're going to summarize. Potential transmission pathways, again, what we found with this B313 spillover is that it's coming down to animal movements, visitors and shared vehicles and shared equipment, shared employees, right? So animals, machines, and people. And this isn't unique. That's common to a lot of outbreaks, but we are seeing it consistently across the country. And then I wanted to kind of highlight this bottom portion here. And Dr. Baldwin talked about this already, but this virus has not been found in migratory birds since that initial spillover event sometime in December of last year in Texas. All of the spread that has happened since then has been cow to cow or farm to farm. We have seen some of that spill back from affected dairies or affected poultry operations into some of those peri-domestic species that are outlined here. So just something to keep in mind. We've heard a lot that, there are a lot of questions about the bird component. B313 is not being spread by our migratory waterfowl. And then lastly, if you're wondering, well, what the heck am I supposed to do with all this information? Well, when we look at movement, maybe it's a good time to sit down and look at the traffic on your farm. Or if you're a veterinarian working with your producers, farmers, to look at that. If it's something that's not absolutely essential to the operation, can you eliminate it? If you can't, and it's all essential, and I assume the majority of it is, right? You need it for that dairy to operate. Can you control the traffic flow of those vendors and those visitors? A certain access point in, another one out, keeping them out of high traffic areas whenever possible. And when they're on site, just keeping in mind, what can I do to maximize the distance between those visitors or vehicles and my herd and my employees even, who are really dedicated to caring for that herd? By minimizing that contact, it helps to reduce your risk. And if you're interested in more of a deep dive on biosecurity, please, if you've been affected, reach out to your case manager. If you haven't, I'd suggest reaching out to the CDA office, and we can certainly help to answer some of those questions or kind of look things over with you. And with that, thank you so very much for your attention. Huge shout out to Dawn for the extra time. Thank you, guys.
Jamie, that was fantastic. I'm always amazed by people that can take very complex epidemiology information and boil it down to something that makes sense. And so what I heard from you is that there's no such thing as a closed herd because we have all kinds of other connections. But don't despair. There are mitigation measures we can put in place with biosecurity to prevent that spread via lateral transmission.
Absolutely. There's always hope. All right.
Great. Thank you, Jamie. Really appreciate that. So next up, we have Dr. Allison Kohnen, who is our state public health veterinarian, and she is going to share the public health updates, public health perspective. Slides look great, Allison.
Okay, great. The Zoom moved me over, and so I got that last 1 second. Okay, I think yeah, there we go.
Yep, I can hear you and see you great. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, good evening, everybody. I think I'm the last presentation, if that's correct, Maggie, but I'm going to round everything out with public health. And we've learned a lot of good information and good updates on what Colorado's been doing for the last 6 months as we've been responding to this emerging pathogen and outbreak in cattle. And I will say that the public health response has really had to pivot. Traditionally, the avian influenza virus is very rare to infect humans, and we've seen very sporadic infections, particularly with the H5 virus, and haven't seen it in the last decade in the United States. But that has changed with the infections in cattle. And so I'll go into a little bit of detail what we've been seeing nationally, and then our big responses in Colorado from CDPHE. Okay. So, like I said, novel influenza, and that's influenza viruses that infect humans that have animal hosts, are called novel or variant influenza infections. And those include the H5H7, highly pathogenic and low pathogenic avian influenzas, as well as variant H1 and H3 that typically come from swine. Influenza are influenza A infections in humans that we are concerned about, and they're, as I said, called novel influenza infections. And they're rare. We see on average in the last decade in the United States has been approximately 15 cases annually of variant influenza. And that can be very sporadic depending on localized outbreaks. And most of those cases have been associated with swine contact. This year is different. And since the emergence of the H5N1 virus in wild birds, subsequently poultry, in 22 in the United States, we have had 15 cases. Notably, Colorado was the first state to report a H5N1 case back in 2022 associated with culling activities in poultry. That case now would not make the case definition, and I'll go over that in the next slide. But since March, we have seen 14 confirmed cases of H5N1 in humans in the United States. 4 of those have been following exposure to dairy cattle, 1 case in Texas, 2 in Michigan, and 1 here in Colorado. And the remaining 9 have been from association with poultry. And all of those, unfortunately, have come from Colorado. And most recently, so in early September, Missouri actually reported a case of H5N1 that was detected by routine national surveillance for influenza. It was an unsubtypable clinical specimen that did confirm by H5. And in investigation, Missouri did not find any direct contact with animals. I think that investigation is currently ongoing, looking for potential source of that infection. But all of these cases have since recovered, and many of them received treatment with an antiviral called oseltamivir due to their symptoms. So this is a very stark image on this slide. Conjunctivitis has been the predominant clinical sign reported and observed in patients confirmed with H5N1 infection this year. And we've also heard of many anecdotal reports of a significant number of dairy workers either working directly with sick cattle in the hospital pens or milkers that had reported clinical signs, but yet were never tested for this infection. So in March, this raised significant concerns on the public health side and started a lot of contingent planning about what to do if this virus came to the state. I do want to give a little bit of information about what would constitute a case for human infection. And this case definition was most recently updated this year with the Council of State and Territorial Epidemiologists, and they then put forward that recommendation to the CDC for the National Notifiable Disease System. And so the new case definition will require, for clinical criteria, will require one of the following predominant clinical signs, being cough, sore throat, fever, which is either actual measured fever or a subjective feeling feverish, a report of clinical sign, shortness of breath or difficulty breathing, and conjunctivitis. And conjunctivitis is a notable clinical sign that's been added to this case definition. Or they may meet case definition if they report two or more of the following clinical signs, which are less common for influenza infections, but could include headache, muscle aches, joint aches, fatigue, runny nose, nasal congestion, and diarrhea and vomiting, much less common signs. As I said, our 2022 case would not have met this case definition as they only reported one sign of fatigue, but it is still counts as a case by CDC. In addition, in our state, we do require some exposure history in order to actually test for H5 outside of routine surveillance activities. And so we assess whether individuals reporting clinical illness have had direct contact with suspect infected or confirmed infected animals or a reservoir species that could be infected. And that would include a poultry species, our wild birds, dairy cattle, and cats. And cats have come up multiple times, and I will actually touch on that at the end of my presentation. As well as having a bracketing of time since between their onset as well as time since their last exposure. And so that 10-day mark is used in routine monitoring of persons that have been exposed to infected animals. So they would need to have been exposed within 10 days and have symptom onset during that window to qualify for testing. An alternative way that we may find cases, and we have not here in Colorado, but this would be an example of where Missouri detected a case, was clinical specimens that were positive for influenza A, which is a common or seasonal flu, H1 or H3 in humans, that was unsubtypable. And so that may prompt subsequent testing to test directly for H5. So I'm going to go very briefly over what we were responding to in infected dairy farms. And as CDPHE, as well as our local public health agencies in partnership, we were involved in every detection in dairy cattle in the state. Luckily, with our great collaboration with the Colorado Department of Agriculture and their strong relationships with you all, being able to talk directly with you as producers. We worked very closely with many herd veterinarians as well to look at the workforce and look at their health and safety. The goals of CDPHE and the LPHA, local public health agencies' response to detections in dairy farms were threefold. Predominantly, we wanted to make direct contact with the producers and go through an epidemiologic questionnaire that focused more on worker exposures and their standard practices, PPE usage, and reported clinical signs. So we started there, getting an overall picture of the operation and having some connection with that workforce and getting an understanding of whether or not there had been illness in that population. Either in conjunction or subsequent to that interview, public health officials were on the ground at the dairy operations, most of the time in collaboration with the CDA or USDA case manager, in order to have one-on-one, direct face-to-face contact, and also get a brief tour when possible of the parlors and other workspaces that the dairy workers were faced with to assess for potential transmission risk to humans. We also offered a service and still ongoing to offer free PPE, a 4-week supply of PPE, including surgical masks, respirators, goggles, face shields, and gloves to help protect workers from potential transmission while the herd was infected. We had several producers participate in that program, either ordering PPE prior to a detection in their herd, or at the time of detection, requesting us to deliver PPE to their farm. And we were then later collecting some information on PPE adherence and how well that was going. Our other goal on site visits was to assess if there were symptomatic workers, we would like to get them tested, and also be able to offer them that antiviral, also tenofovir. We did this on several operations, and ultimately one positive came out of that work of testing dairy workers on site. During that site visit, we were looking to establish monitoring for worker health during the ongoing outbreak in that herd. So we got a snapshot of potentially whether there were illnesses present at the beginning of the outbreak in the herd, or maybe even before producers noticed clinical signs in cattle, which we can't do much about. We can't go back and prevent those infections, but we wanted to make sure we were preventing ongoing spread to people throughout the outbreak. And so in most cases with producers, we were asking them to supply us with an aggregate count of individuals that they were checking in with on a daily basis and checking for clinical signs consistent with influenza infection. And we had great compliance with being able to do this monitoring and ensure that we didn't have additional infections going undetected. So we had several producers report to us with clinical signs in a handful of workers that we then responded to, went back out on site to offer testing or arrange testing with the local health department and local service providers. There is a strong interest in how many workers potentially had been exposed and actually developed an infection where they would have systemic antibodies to that as a marker of past infection. And so CDC started an initiative to conduct a serosurvey among dairy workers in states that had affected farms. And so Colorado did initiate this study, and we had our staff CDC field epidemiology officer who reached out to 48 of our affected dairies and asked whether they would be willing to have their workers participate in this study. The results are still pending, so I don't have results to share with you, but based on that outreach, we had 3 operations consent to arrange for CDPHE to come on site alongside CDC and deliver this study, which was completely voluntary by the workers, but producers, shared flyers and the information ahead of time so that we actually had really great participation. And majority of the workers that did participate were milk workers, or they had tasks that were involved with manure management and seeing sick cattle. So it was very much the target population of the workforce that we were looking for that participated. And we interviewed about 83 workers, and 72 of those interviews were in Spanish. So we already knew that we had a predominantly Spanish-speaking workforce, and we had those resources available in order to do this effectively, and collected data on their PPE usage, their work duties, as well as self-reported clinical signs at the time that the dairy cattle were affected or they were working with sick cattle. we did have a significant portion of these participants that consented to a blood sample so that serology could be run. And that is currently being run at CDC and hopefully results in the next month or so.
Hey, Allison, just wanted to give you a quick 2-minute warning. Thanks.
Thanks. I won't make it through all of this in 2 minutes. I will say that our response to poultry workers was very different than it was at the beginning of the dairy response. And I just wanted to explain why we ended up with 9 cases in Colorado, and we have no other cases associated with poultry outbreaks in the United States. So here's a quick timeline of what happened when we had 2 detections in poultry. Of course, we had the first facility that was positive, and then within 48 hours, depopulation activities started. Within 2 days of those activities starting, these were contract workers that were not direct employees of that poultry operation. We did receive reports of a few symptomatic workers. And so CDPHE mobilized a field team to respond to this on the same day. And with the great assistance of the case managers and everyone that was responding on site, facilitated getting every worker out of those barns that self-reported symptoms. And we actually had over 100 workers coming out of those barns to be screened for symptoms. And so we reestablished the next morning and went through screening all of the workers for symptoms and had a very large, what we would call attack rate among these workers with clinical signs. So at the first facility, we ended up having about a quarter of those workers that were doing depopulation activities self-reporting clinical signs. And we tested a significant number of workers. We've tested over 137 workers to date since May. And on that first facility, we had 6 positives. And I had jumped through that timeline, but we did the same activities at the second poultry operation and got three other positives. So when we looked into that, we noticed a difference of PPE usage among workers between the 2 facilities, and was able to implement a PPE compliance assessment and get that number to increase over the activities on facility A, and might explain the slight increase in number of cases we saw. The biggest takeaway here is that 100% of our detected cases reported conjunctivitis as their clinical sign, while several, including all of the individuals that tested negative, reported a mirage of different clinical signs. Conjunctivitis was 100% in our positives and over 50% in the individuals that were actually negative. And so we suspect that there probably were more cases. We did look at CT values, talked about contamination risk, and based on the way that the screening went after the first initial day where we were testing workers before entering barns, our chance of contamination was significantly reduced by that practice. And so we presume that we may have actually had more H5 infections because we see that people might shed that virus for even less than 24 hours, and they may be positive one day and negative the next. So we could have missed some of these cases. I'm over time, but I was hoping I could touch on the cats.
Yeah, Allison, if you want to maybe just very, very briefly, like in a minute or less, because we do have Dr. Goodell is our last speaker. And so we want to make sure he's got enough time. And then we do have a lot of questions that are coming in the chat and the Q&A. That'd be great.
Got it. Sure thing. So as in Dr. Baldwin's slides earlier, we've had 6 cat detections in Colorado. I wanted to provide a little bit more background. Public health has been involved predominantly because of the overlap in clinical presentation with rabies, and we are the lead for rabies in domestic household pets. So we've had 4 cases that were detected within 2 weeks of each other in Larimer County, and they were all genomically linked to a suspected affected dairy that was later diagnosed by the surveillance program. We've also had a fifth case that was on a known infected dairy. And then the sixth case, which we've had unknown exposure. It was an indoor-only cat that had no risk factors reported and in the Denver metro area, not around any affected cattle. Unfortunately, that case was not able to be sequenced, and so we aren't able to use that data to infer where that animal was potentially infected. I think what's important to take away here is the history in these cases. Many of them had history of hunting, small mammals or birds and roaming off the property. And several of these cases live near a dairy. And so I don't anticipate there's unknown routes of exposure or something that's novel here. And this indoor only cat could have been from fomite transmission, but we don't have enough information to make that assumption. And so we have monitored humans in contact with cats, have not had any detections. We tested 2 individuals that were in contact, and they both tested negative. So I will just stop there. Sorry for going over.
No, that's all right. No worries, Allison. And I know you do have resources as well in your slides. You can drop those in the chat for folks. I think that would be great. If you want to, great, stop sharing. I was just going to say, and then a couple comments while we get Greg up next. Dr. McCarty did drop the link for the CE form in the chat. So if you are a veterinarian and you want continuing education credit for this, please fill out the form. We are also requesting feedback on how the webinar went for you and what you would like to hear from us in the future. So please fill that out. With that, I am pleased to have Dr. Greg Goodell on. He has been a really valuable member of our joint technical HPAI working group, and knows dairy in and out. So it's been really a pleasure to get to work with Greg over the last several months. And so he's going to give a private practicing veterinarian perspective. So Greg, over to you. Thank you.
Maggie, thanks a bunch. Appreciate it. I'll say that if everybody's, those that are still here at 5:30, hats off to you. It's a lot of good info that's presented. And what I'm going to do, or what Maggie asked me to do today, is just kind of give an overview of boots on the ground perspective, preparation, treatment, triage of animals. This may be a little bit of old hat if you've already had it and you're here in Colorado and seen it and you've been through it. But there may be, if you haven't, this will be a little bit of maybe provide a little bit of help. For those who don't know me, my name is Greg Goodell. We have a dairy practice in Greeley, Colorado. We do nothing but practice dairy, and I think we have the distinct, maybe dubious approach of being able to work with a lot of these dairies that were affected. So we've got a fair amount of experience there. And Maggie, if it's okay, that document I sent to you an hour or two ago, can I share the screen and just kind of review that since I don't have slides?
Yep, that would be great. Absolutely.
Okay, let me do that. Okay, can everybody see this?
That looks great.
If so, okay. So this is a document that we put together some time ago. We've been working with a lot of these herds for several months at this point. And over the first 2 or 3 or even 5 herds, we kind of we put some assumptions together. And moving forward, this is what we used to really get a herd ready once they became positive. And certainly with the mandatory bulk testing program, it was really helpful there because a lot of times, a herd would know a week or 2 ahead of time. So here's our assumptions. And again, I'm not an epidemiologist. This is what we've seen on the dairy, and this is how we helped a producer get ready. And these are numbers that we basically threw at them. If you're in a surveillance testing program, there's a national program. I don't know if anybody in Colorado's on it that's voluntary. But if you're on that program or in the mandatory bulk testing program and you get a positive bulk tank, you have somewhere around 1 to 2 weeks to get prepped before you really start seeing cows pop into the hospital pen. And usually it's a knock on the office door that said, hey, we've had an extra 12 cows out of 30 that came in today. They all have indigestion. Oh, okay, bad silage. All right. Well, that's the first sign that something's going on there. So that bulk tank, just know that if that's positive, you got a couple of weeks, one in some cases. Um, know that it takes some time to get that result back, and it's not just an issue with the state lab or anything else. Sometimes it takes, if anybody's dealt with UPS or FedEx, sometimes some of those mail services are taking 3, 4, 5 days, especially in more rural parts, to get a sample out to the lab. So if you get a sample back at 2 weeks or even 1 week, you're knocking on the door of seeing those cows really come in to the hospital pen. Um, Let's see, a lot of I guess maybe I can highlight this if that would help anybody. Yeah, what we ended up boiling therapies down a lot just to make it quick and simple for these dairies. When this hits and you have hundreds of cows coming in, or let me put it this way, if your sick pen, hospital pen is built for 1 or 2% and you have 10% of the herd that just came in today, we're trying to boil things down and keep things as simple as we can. Probably the biggest thing is the oral fluids on these cows. Most of the cows that come in will be mild in case, a little bit of oral fluids, and if they have a fever, if they have something else going on there, we would also provide, in addition to the fluids, an antipyretic just to get that fever down. Our big ticket items for these dairies mostly would be to control that fever and get those non-febrile cows that come in clinical, basically with a little diarrhea, mastitis, whatever, get those rumens moving again. So fluids was pretty much it on those mild cases. And then I think I've got something down here below that I'll throw out. Before I get there, ballpark figures. Here's some more ballpark figures, right? Again, not an epidemiologist. This is how we got producers prepared when we had to. You can assume that you're going to have 6 to 8% of your herd requiring treatment, clinical cows, coming to your hospital on any given day, or in the hospital at any given time, I should say. In the end, you're going to see 20 to 25% of the herd treated over the course of 6 to 8 weeks. And the majority of those treatments are going to fall in the first 2 or 3 weeks. So that's going to be one of those things that already the producer's like, holy smokes, how am I going to do that? What am I going to do? Well, if you're fortunate enough to get a week or two head start, the things that we would, kind of try to get on board with the producer and have them do is, hey, let's get some additional fluids brought in here. What's your fluid of choice? We just want a lot of primarily oral fluids. Are using aspirin, using Barnabei. Let's get some more of that ordered up. What's your antibiotic? We typically recommend a general broad spectrum antibiotic. There's a lot of the Zoetis product being used. There's a lot of Polyflex being used. We want a good broad spectrum antibiotic on some of those more severe cows. The other thing that you're going to want to do is you're going to want to be able to figure out a way to drench a whole lot of cows in a hurry. Again, if the majority of your cows are mild, basically we break mild and severe down to fevers or not. Again, we're trying to keep it simple. There's probably something a little better. It could be different on every dairy. But in the heat of the moment, when you have 2 or 3 guys trying to treat a whole bunch of cows, you need to kind of keep things simple and kind of keep things moving. So find a way to drench cows as quickly as possible. A lot of these ideas, I don't have them. If anybody wants to see them, reach out. I guess put my email in the chat at the end of this, but most of the stuff that I've seen came from producers. Producers are quick thinkers. They're quick on their feet, and boy, when they need to get something done, they come up with some pretty good ideas. A lot of the stuff that I would share with you if you were to reach out would be just some of those examples. Other things to think about, manpower. You're going to be, the dairy's going to be just slammed for a couple of weeks. In fact, this is typical. It seems like at the beginning of it, they'll call and they say, yeah, I think we've got bird flu. We've got 20%, 10% more cows that came in today. I'm not sure what's going on. They get started about day 10, and of course it's bird flu. About day 10, they say, Greg, I think it stopped. I think we're good. And what we've learned is, no, it's probably plateauing. What they mean by stopped is they're not getting, 6, 5, 6, 7% new cows every day. It's the number coming in is plateaued. That tends to kind of eke out for about 3, 4, 5 more days. About the 2-week mark, we start seeing cows going out beating cows coming in. So we start to see a decrease in the hospital pen. So there's some things there. Treatments, you know, every dairy we talk to, and I've talked with a bunch of people throughout the U.S. now. In fact, I've had a few calls from California the last week or two, and I'm telling them the same thing. You know, figure out what your treatment approach is. We typically boil treatments down to treating indigestion or pneumonia, because that, you know, the pneumonia can be a broad case definition, if you will. Those two treatments on a dairy typically mimic fairly closely what we try to get into a cow. So indigestion treatments, a lot of times we're given just fluids, oral fluids, and aspirin. It'd be nice to give aspirin 2, if not 3 times a day. I've got dairies that only gave it once and they seem to help. If we look at a pneumonia treatment, we're basically giving fluids, Banamine, and a broad spectrum antibiotic. Those would be cows that are coming in with a fever. Those cows, you know, and again, at this point, we're trying to reduce our secondary disease issues, which you hear a lot about, right? You're going to hear pneumonia, mastitis, and abortion. I can peg those 3 almost every single time. You know, regardless of what your case definition is, that's the sort of stuff that we're going to see. That's at least what's going to be diagnosed. And the majority of those cows during an outbreak are going to be bird flu. Triage, I'll get into that a little bit. Triage, the biggest issue is going to be pen space. I've kind of already alluded to the fact that at any point in time, you're probably going to have 6, 7, 8%. And remember, this is just our experience on the dairies. The virus doesn't read the book. You might have more, you might have less. But if you're prepped for these numbers, you're typically going to be prepped for as much of a success outcome as you can get here. So again, biggest issue is pen space. What we've done on some dairies, depending on what the personnel or the owner wants to do, we have converted a milking pen to a hospital pen. And then you got to make sure you train the milkers not to bring them in. You got antibiotics in that pen and all that. Or you just simply expand the hospital somehow. So that's going to be the biggest issue, is going to be pen situations there, or pen space. It's going to be worse to crowd a bunch of cows. You know, if you're looking at July or August of this year when we had 100-degree temps, there were some pretty bad looking cows. I mean, they looked bad. What's amazing is how quickly those cows come along. You'll look at them one day and swear, you know, they're just not going to make it till tomorrow, and then the next day their udders already beginning to fill up. It's that quick when we're talking individual cows. So I'll kind of jump down there. As far as triage goes, we move cows out when they begin to look better. We would love to keep those cows in the hospital pen as long as we can. In the end of 2 weeks, you're out of space and wondering if you've got to convert 3 or more pens to another hospital pen. So basically, once a cow started looking better, once she got a little bit of udder fill coming back and the rumen begins working again, then we started moving those cows out. A lot of times we can peg 3 to 5 days for that to happen. We'll start seeing that turnover in that pen at about that time. I kind of went through this real quick. I think the only thing that I'll add in there is some of the biosecurity measures. You know, and again, if you haven't been through this, you know, your herd veterinarian can be a pretty good resource for you. There's all sorts of stuff. There was great stuff that was already presented here in terms of what can be done for biosecurity. On several herds later on in this outbreak, we talked to the producers about moving the render pile to the perimeter of the property. We had a parking area near the entrance for all employees, and then the employees were taken into the dairy. We set up makeshift or temporary outdoor facilities. So boots, coveralls all stayed at the dairy. They didn't go home with the workers. They were washed, laundered, and kept at the dairy, disinfected at the dairy. We're trying to keep all that stuff at the dairy. There's a whole bunch more, and I'm already, you know, I'm bumping 550 here, and I know we're trying to keep this stuff on time. But there's a lot of good info there. Again, I guess what I'll do, Maggie, I hope this was something that you were looking for here. This conversation typically goes about an hour with a producer, and I kind of just done it in about 15 minutes, but I'll put my email in the chat box there. And of course, if there's any questions, if there's time for that, I can sure do that too.
Yeah, Greg, that is great. And actually, as soon as you said you were going to drop your email in the chat, I did it for you. So your email is already in the chat and has been distributed. One of the questions that was asked by one of our participants was, is this document shareable? And I encourage them to reach out directly to you via email about that.
Absolutely. It's been shared a whole bunch already. It's more meant for Colorado, and I kind of customize this a little bit so anybody can use it. Again, I can share that super easy and not a problem. Just send me an email.
Okay, great. Well, Greg, if you want to stop sharing your screen, we will open it up now for our Q&A. We have a lot of questions that have already been asked. And our panelists, please feel free to come back on camera so everybody can see who is behind our screens. We have a number of questions that have been asked already in the chat box and the Q&A. Some of them I have answered already, but I am going to ask them and have some of our folks answer some of these questions. The first question I'm going to ask to Dr. McCarty, actually, and that is, this was Dr. Russo that asked this question. What is the CT cutoff for bulk tanks for a positive? And has that changed during the 9 weeks? And I had mentioned in there what the cutoff was and what we changed it to. So Dr. McCarty, if you want to explain that a little bit.
Yes, so there actually is no specific cutoff for the initial positive. So if it's positive at CSU, presumptive positive, it is considered positive. So CSU, Christy can speak to this, but I'm pretty sure they use 40 as their cutoff for positive or presumptive positive and negative. So that's what we were using, and if those dairies, stayed over, under 40 and were consistently positive, they're considered positive. Now, once they're released from quarantine and they are truly negative, which means CT values are over 40, then they would stay released from quarantine. They would be a negative herd unless their CT values fell under 36. And so as long as their CT values stayed above 36, they were not put back under quarantine. So hopefully that answers the question there. If you ask why the number is 36, NVSL is sequencing these at 35. And so we were sending anything under 36 to NVSL in hopes of getting sequencing on those. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thanks, Morgan. The follow-up question that she had on that was there any concern about these dairies being truly negative risk-wise with the lower CT value? And this is something that we talked about as a group, and we talked about, quite a bit. And we felt that, here in Colorado, because we were doing bulk tank testing and because 75% of our herds were already affected, for our state, there was no risk. And there's no risk for other states because individual cows are required to be tested prior to movement anyway. So we felt that we already had a pretty negligible risk with that. Good question. The next question I'm going to pose, Dr. Barnabei answered this a little bit, but maybe pose this jointly to Jamie and Morgan, is can you please tell us what has been found in peridomestic species? I think the water supplies and other environmental samples, there's a lot of research going on right now. I don't think we'll touch that because we don't have a lot of time. But Morgan, or I guess Jamie, since you had it on your slide, do you want to just mention some of what those peridomestic species were that we did have detections in? Or Morgan can also touch on that if that's easier because she has all of the Colorado specific data.
Yeah, I think because the graphic that I showed was at the national level. So Morgan, if you want to take Colorado specific.
Yeah, so as far as peridomestic species, there shockingly has not been a lot found on dairies. So there was, without a doubt, Wildlife Services with USDA did go out and do wildlife sampling at various dairies and found very few peridomestic species surrounding the dairies. Now, certainly we are considering the cats as a potential, they are falling under Wildlife Services for reporting, and while Wildlife Services did test some cats on dairies, they actually were negative. Although one of the reports we got out of a dairy was the first sign they thought something was wrong was the cats were sick, and then the cats disappeared. And so unfortunately, none of those cats were available for testing. Now, the poultry facilities were completely different. The peridomestic species that were found around positive poultry facilities, those were, various songbirds, various other birds, and a lot of mice were found to be positive. And there was a raccoon found on a dairy premises. The badger that was found on the poultry premises was negative. So there was a lot of sampling, and I do actually have slides that goes through exactly what species were found. And we're short on time today, but anybody interested in seeing the information is de-identified. So, but we do have, on the one positive poultry prem, there was 250 samples, and over 100 different or 100 samples were positive. Like I said, a lot of those were mice and songbirds, and those were not found dead or sick or diseased. Those were caught birds and tested, or caught mammals and tested. So hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, thank you, Morgan, for that. That was great. We have a few more questions that were submitted. If anybody has any, just drop them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to them. Greg, I'm actually going to jump down to the last couple questions that were for you, and that is there an issue with secondary bacterial infections? Why the antibiotic? And then the subsequent question was, drench with what?
Yeah, so I for sure an issue with secondary bacterial infections. In fact, we kind of treat it just as we mentioned earlier. If they're afebrile, we treat them as a mild case. And if they have a fever, and typically the fevers are pretty high, although some of these dairies in July and August, you don't know if it was because of ambient temperature or virus, but we did see a fair amount of that. In fact, again, so much more that I didn't have time to go over, but one of the things that we see a lot of is trying to control those fevers. And we can really reduce things like abortions and secondary pneumonias. You'll go onto dairies, and what you'll see 6 weeks, 4 weeks post-infection is to see an increase in pneumonias or abortions or mastitis. And of course, it's all being blamed, and probably rightfully so, on HPAI. But I think a lot of it, like anything else, if you have a major fever, 105, 106, 107 degrees, oftentimes, it doesn't matter what started that fever is going to really cause problems with the cows. So yeah, secondary infections are a big deal. We use any general antibiotic that a practitioner would use. I haven't seen a whole lot of penicillin, but with things like some of the Exceed products, Septifuer products, Polyflex, stuff like that, we would use. You're going to want to keep it simple. And fluids. Oral fluids do tremendous wonders for these herds. We've also done things like set a big old bale of oat straw or oat hay in the pen and just let them chew on it. We're trying to get those rumens started. So that's really the crux of the treatments.
Okay. Thank you, Greg. Appreciate that. Next question I'm going to ask to Ginger with CDPHE on the human side. I'm wondering why there is not more universal testing of individuals who report to a healthcare provider with symptoms that fit the criteria outlined. I believe the spread human to human is much greater than is indicated by the data we have at this point. Ginger?
Thanks, Maggie. Hi, I'm Ginger Stringer. I'm the Epi Response Manager at CDPHE. So I think, right now, the CDC assessment of the viruses that they have sequenced during this response is that there would be additional mutations necessary for the virus to efficiently attach to human cells that would make it transmit easily person to person. And I'll drop a link to the CDC technical reports, and you can dig into what those binders and receptors are in more detail. So I think in the absence of that concern, we think that the most likely source of exposure is going to be to sick animals, which is why we are testing those people with priority. We do also have surveillance systems that, like in other states, we routinely sequence and type flu samples just in our general surveillance system so that, normal, quote unquote, normal flu cases, a subset of those are getting tested at our state lab and typed to see if they are H5. We also have some wastewater surveillance programs where we're looking for H5 in our wastewater systems. And that's a system that we're still learning a lot about, how to use that information. But I think that will be another indicator for us if we have increased concerns about human-to-human transmission. If any of those things change, we will change our approach and, take a more widespread testing approach. But for now, we think that the testing and surveillance that we have is appropriate for where we are.
Thank you, Ginger, for that. As always, being flexible and nimble in this outbreak is what we have learned as things change. So, Greg mentioned this a little bit ago, but I will say an hour and 59 minutes into the webinar, and we still have a 75% retention rate of people that started is pretty darn good. So really big hats off to all of our participants today. And really big thank you to all of our presenters today. We could not do this without all of you that are involved in this. And I hope that this webinar today was really helpful for you guys to understand where are we right now in HPAI response? What do we know? What do we not know? What's changing? And so we will try to keep everybody updated. For our veterinarians, if you are not on our newsletter list, please sign up for that. That'll be the best place for you to keep up to date. We do send updates out through our industry members as well. So if you are part of any of our industry organizations on the dairy, the cattle, the poultry side, you'll get updates through that. And then, of course, stay in touch on our website as well, and watch for those website changes coming soon. So again, really a big thank you to everybody. Appreciate the great participation, great questions, and thanks again to our speakers. And for our veterinarians, it looks like a lot of folks have filled out the CE form. Morgan, do you want to drop it just one more time real quick for our veterinarians? If you want to click on it before we end the webinar, this is your last chance to get your CE certificate. If anybody has issues receiving it, you should automatically get a CE certificate that has been generated. If you don't, reach out to our office and we'll be happy to look into that. So thank you, everybody. Take care. Have a good evening.